You know what's one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a military organization? When political control becomes more important than military effectiveness. And what Xi Jinping has been doing to the People's Liberation Army over the last few years represents exactly that kind of transformation. Because when you start purging generals based on political reliability rather than military competence, when you concentrate decision-making authority in one person rather than developing institutional expertise, when you prioritize loyalty over experience and conformity over critical thinking, you're not building a stronger military. You're building a more controllable military. And there's a huge difference between those two things. A difference that affects not just Chinese strategic capabilities, but regional stability and global security in ways that most people don't fully understand. Let me walk you through what's actually been happening in the PLA, because understanding these internal dynamics is crucial to understanding how China approaches major strategic decisions, including decisions about Taiwan that could affect everyone. The numbers alone tell a remarkable story. Xi Jinping has removed or replaced over 60% of the Central Military Commission's senior leadership since 2012. That's not normal rotation of personnel. That's systematic elimination of institutional memory, independent judgment, and alternative perspectives. The Central Military Commission is supposed to be China's equivalent of the Pentagon's senior leadership, the institutional structure that provides strategic planning, operational coordination, and professional military advice to political leadership. When you replace 60% of that institutional leadership in just over a decade, you're not improving military effectiveness. You're ensuring that the people who remain understand that their careers depend on telling political leadership what it wants to hear, rather than providing accurate assessments of military realities. And that's exactly what these purges seem designed to achieve. Political control that eliminates dissent, alternative perspectives, and institutional pushback against strategic decisions that professional military judgment might question. But here's the fundamental problem with that approach. Modern military operations are incredibly complex. They require coordination between multiple services, integration of advanced technologies, real-time adaptation to changing conditions, and decision-making at multiple levels simultaneously. You can't run that kind of operation through centralized political control. You need institutional expertise, professional judgment, and the ability to make rapid decisions based on military rather than political considerations. When you purge the people who have that expertise and replace them with people whose primary qualification is political loyalty, you're trading military effectiveness for political control. That trade-off might make sense from Xi Jinping's perspective if his primary concern is maintaining political authority rather than maximizing military capabilities. But it creates serious problems for China's ability to conduct successful military operations against competent opponents. And the lack of combat experience makes these institutional problems much worse, because combat experience isn't just about individual soldiers knowing how to shoot. It's about institutional knowledge of how military operations actually work under the stress and uncertainty of real conflict. The PLA hasn't fought a significant military operation since the 1979 border conflict with Vietnam. That's 45 years without institutional combat experience. 3 generations of military leaders who have never managed real military operations against opponents who shoot back. That's not just a training problem. That's an institutional knowledge problem that affects everything from tactical procedures to strategic planning to logistics coordination. Military organizations learn most of their important lessons through actual operations. How communication systems work under combat stress, how supply chains function when they're being attacked, how coordination between different units breaks down when plans encounter enemy resistance. You can't learn those lessons through exercises and simulations. You learn them through actual combat operations where mistakes have real consequences and theoretical plans get tested against practical realities. The Chinese military has advanced equipment, sophisticated technology, and extensive training programs, but they don't have institutional knowledge of how those capabilities actually perform when everything goes wrong simultaneously, which is what happens in real military operations. And the purges have eliminated most of the senior leaders who at least had some exposure to that kind of institutional learning from earlier conflicts. The result is a military organization that looks impressive on paper but hasn't been tested under the kind of stress that reveals whether theoretical capabilities translate into practical effectiveness. But it gets worse when you consider how modern military operations actually work, because the rigid, centralized approach that these purges seem designed to create is exactly the opposite of what effective modern military operations require. Modern warfare happens too fast and involves too many variables for centralized decision-making to work effectively. You need decentralized execution by people who understand the overall objectives, but can adapt tactics and procedures based on real-time conditions. That requires a culture that encourages initiative, rewards accurate reporting even when the news is bad, and develops leaders who can make good decisions under pressure without waiting for detailed instructions from higher authority. But cultures that encourage initiative and independent judgment are exactly what political purges are designed to eliminate. You can't have military leaders who are trained to think independently about military problems while ensuring they never think independently about political problems. The institutional culture that produces effective military leadership is incompatible with the institutional culture that produces reliable political loyalty. And China seems to be choosing political loyalty over military effectiveness, which creates vulnerabilities that could become catastrophic if they ever have to conduct actual military operations against serious opponents. The training problems make this even more concerning because, from what we can observe, PLA training emphasizes rehearsed scenarios and predetermined responses rather than adaptability and creative problem solving. That works fine for ceremonial functions and exercises where everyone knows the script. It works very poorly for actual military operations where the enemy doesn't follow your script and conditions change faster than central authority can issue new instructions. Real combat requires soldiers and officers who can figure out solutions to problems they've never encountered before, using resources that weren't originally intended for those purposes, while operating under stress and uncertainty that makes careful planning impossible. You develop those capabilities through training that emphasizes adaptability, critical thinking, and independent decision-making. But those are exactly the capabilities that political control systems are designed to suppress. The Chinese military is trying to build modern military capabilities while maintaining political control systems that prevent the development of the institutional culture that modern military capabilities require. That contradiction affects everything from individual unit training to strategic operational planning to the development of military doctrine that could be effective against competent opponents. And the fact that China is studying Russian military performance in Ukraine should be particularly concerning because what they should be learning from that conflict is that rigid, centralized military systems perform very poorly against opponents who encourage initiative and adaptation. Russian military performance in Ukraine demonstrates exactly what happens when you prioritize political control over military effectiveness, when you purge independent-minded leaders, when you create institutional cultures that punish accurate reporting and reward conformity. If China is studying the Ukrainian conflict and drawing the lesson that they need more political control and more centralized decision-making, they're learning exactly the wrong lessons from Russian failures. But if they're drawing the right lessons about the importance of decentralized execution and independent judgment, then they face the fundamental contradiction between effective military organization and reliable political control. Either way, the institutional pressures created by the purges make it very difficult for the Chinese military to develop the capabilities that modern warfare actually requires. And this brings us to probably the most concerning aspect of these developments. how they affect Chinese decision-making about major strategic operations, particularly regarding Taiwan. Because when you eliminate the institutional voices that might provide cautious, realistic assessments of military capabilities and operational risks, you create conditions where political leadership might make strategic decisions based on incomplete or overly optimistic information. The generals who might have said, "Mr. Chairman, our assessment is that we're not ready for this kind of operation," have been replaced by generals who understand that their careers depend on providing assessments that support whatever the political leadership wants to do. That's exactly how countries stumble into military operations that seem achievable based on political preferences, but turn out to be catastrophic when they encounter practical military realities. And the Taiwan scenario represents exactly the kind of complex, high-risk military operation where the difference between accurate assessment and wishful thinking could determine success or failure. Taiwan operations would require coordinated amphibious assault, air superiority operations, logistic support over contested sea lanes, urban warfare, and sustained operations against opponents who have been preparing for exactly this scenario for decades. That's an incredibly difficult military challenge under the best circumstances. It becomes nearly impossible if your institutional assessment process has been compromised by political pressure to provide optimistic rather than accurate evaluations. When you combine inexperienced leadership, inadequate combat experience, rigid training systems, and institutional pressure to provide politically acceptable rather than militarily accurate assessments, you get conditions where major strategic miscalculations become much more likely. And strategic miscalculations about Taiwan operations wouldn't just affect China and Taiwan. They would affect regional stability, global economic systems, and potentially trigger larger conflicts involving multiple nuclear powers. The purges in the rocket forces are particularly concerning because nuclear forces require extremely high levels of institutional competence, operational reliability, and professional judgment. Nuclear deterrence depends on other countries believing that your nuclear forces are under competent, reliable control by people who understand the strategic and operational implications of nuclear weapons use. When you start purging nuclear forces leadership for political reasons, that raises questions about whether nuclear decision-making is based on strategic and military considerations or political and personal considerations. And uncertainty about nuclear command and control affects strategic stability in ways that increase rather than decrease the risks of conflicts that nobody actually wants. These institutional problems also affect China's relationships with potential allies and partners because other countries have to assess whether Chinese military commitments and security guarantees are based on realistic assessment of Chinese capabilities or political preferences that might not survive contact with military realities. When Chinese military leadership is selected for political loyalty rather than military competence, that affects the credibility of Chinese security relationships and the reliability of Chinese strategic commitments. Countries that might otherwise see China as a viable security partner start questioning whether Chinese military support would be effective if actually needed. And that affects the broader strategic competition between China and other powers because military credibility is a crucial component of international influence and strategic relationships. But let's also consider what this means for regional stability and global security more broadly, because military institutional problems in major powers affect everyone's security interests. When major military powers have institutional problems that affect their strategic assessment capabilities, that increases the likelihood of miscalculation and conflict that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. When major powers make strategic decisions based on political preferences rather than military realities, that creates conditions where conflicts start based on unrealistic expectations and escalate when those expectations encounter practical limitations. And when those conflicts involve nuclear powers in regions that affect global economic and strategic relationships, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate participants. The institutional changes in the Chinese military represent exactly the kind of development that makes strategic miscalculation more likely and strategic conflict more dangerous. Not because China is becoming more militarily capable, but because China might be becoming less capable of making accurate assessments of its military capabilities relative to the challenges those capabilities might face. And that affects everyone who depends on strategic stability, predictable international relationships, and the ability of major powers to make rational decisions about the use of military force. From an American strategic perspective, Chinese military institutional problems create both opportunities and risks. Opportunities in the sense that military organizations with institutional problems are less likely to achieve their strategic objectives successfully, but risks in the sense that those same institutional problems make desperate or miscalculated decisions more likely. A competent Chinese military that accurately assesses its capabilities and limitations is less likely to attempt operations it can't complete successfully. An incompetent Chinese military that overestimates its capabilities might attempt operations that create larger conflicts when they fail. The challenge for American strategic planning is understanding which scenario is more likely and preparing for the possibility that Chinese institutional problems could make conflict more rather than less probable. From a Taiwanese perspective, Chinese military institutional problems provide some tactical advantages but create strategic uncertainties about Chinese decision-making processes. Taiwan's defensive preparations are based on assumptions about Chinese military capabilities and decision-making processes. If those assumptions are wrong because Chinese institutional changes have affected both capabilities and decision-making, then Taiwanese defensive plans might not address the actual scenarios they're most likely to face. From a broader regional perspective, uncertainty about Chinese military capabilities and decision-making affects the strategic calculations of every country in the region. Countries have to make decisions about alliance relationships, military preparations, and strategic positioning based on assessments of Chinese intentions and capabilities. When Chinese institutional changes make those assessments more uncertain, every other country's strategic planning becomes more difficult and potentially less effective. The cumulative effect is increased regional uncertainty and instability that affects economic relationships, security arrangements, and political dynamics throughout the region. And those regional effects inevitably have global implications through economic integration, alliance relationships, and the interconnected nature of modern strategic challenges. The broader lesson is that military institutional health in major powers affects global stability, regardless of whether those powers are allies or competitors. Competent military institutions that provide accurate assessment and professional judgment reduce the likelihood of strategic miscalculation and unnecessary conflict. Incompetent military institutions that prioritize political loyalty over professional expertise increase the risks of miscalculation and conflict that serves nobody's interests. Xi Jinping's approach to PLA leadership might serve his political control objectives, but it creates military institutional problems that affect strategic stability and regional security in ways that extend far beyond Chinese domestic politics. Understanding those institutional dynamics is crucial to understanding how strategic competition evolves and what kinds of conflicts might emerge from institutional weaknesses rather than institutional strengths. Because sometimes the greatest strategic dangers come not from opponents who are too strong, but from opponents whose institutional problems make them unpredictable and prone to miscalculation. And that's exactly what the PLA purges might be creating, a Chinese military that appears strong but has institutional vulnerabilities that could lead to strategic decisions that serve nobody's interests while threatening everyone's security.